It's another cruddy, cold, rainy day out here in January here in Washington. And every time we get one of those days, especially on weekends, our thoughts go to comfort food. And one of the better comfort foods, or more readily thought about comfort foods, is a good crusty loaf of bread, which is traditionally not terribly easy to make at home. Although there are some great guides out there to teach you how to do it. We're going to make what's called a loaf of Dutch oven bread, which is a rather unusual technique that makes a really great crumb and a terrific crust. And it is exactly what it says it is. It's a loaf of bread cooked inside a heavy Dutch oven. If you don't have a Dutch oven, then a regular soup pot will work if it fits in your oven. Those are typically have thinner metal sides, so they don't conduct the heat as well or as evenly, but it's worth a try. As we've said about bread in the past, it doesn't take a lot of work, but it does take a little bit of planning to do it right. So today is Saturday, and it's around 4:30 in the afternoon. We will probably make this loaf tomorrow at about the same time. What we want to do is start out with our sponge, or our biga, which is essentially a mass that we ferment overnight to allow the dough to get some flavor, as well as get the yeast replicating and eating some of the sugars out of the dough. Because we're only making a batch of this, which is going to make a loaf about the size of this dish, we're going to use a smaller amount of biga than we've used in the past for a pizza dough, where we've made about 3 pounds of dough at a time. So what I've got here is about 2/3 of a cup of filtered water, room temperature. And I have some regular instant dried yeast. I'm going to use a very, very small amount of it. Again, when we're talking about well-developed, well-fermented yeast breads, less is typically more. So we have there probably about 1/4 of a teaspoon, or 1/8 of a teaspoon, I beg your pardon, of yeast, that we're just going to add to the water, let it hydrate, and then we'll stir it in. So give that about 5 minutes to rehydrate, and then we'll stir that in. You can see how our granules have rehydrated here. We're just going to agitate them, stir them in, make a big slurry of this. And what we have is some King Arthur flour, bread flour. I'm just going to eyeball this for consistency. I'll put a couple of scoops in here. See how sticky the sponge is. Add a little more if I need to. And a fork works great for this. We're not trying to do a kneaded dough. We're just trying to incorporate the water into the flour. This is a little dry, so we're going to add just a hint more water. And the trick is to get this about the consistency of toothpaste. So it's very sticky, very wet, lumpy, that's fine. Because the intent of this is not to make a dough. The intent of this is to make a fermentation base, sort of like a mother for a vinegar. Or a culture for yogurt. Because bread tastes great if it's made quickly, but if it's allowed to sit and produce some flavors, let those the yeast respire and impart some of its own flavor into the dough, and then let some of the natural bacteria that are in the air impact the acidity of the dough, then we get a much more complex flavor. And again, that's all we do. We're going to cover this, and then we're going to put it aside, and we'll revisit it tomorrow morning when we actually make the final dough. So cover this, and then it'll be about 15 hours, and then we'll revisit it. Good morning. It's about, it's about 8:45 on the following Sunday after we've made our sponge. And let's check it out to see how it looks today. You can see it's changed. It's looked considerably. And it's full of lots of bubbles. That's a good indication that it had a good fermentation last night. Again, we will use this as the base for our bread today as we make the dough. Alright, we're ready to start the dough. And rather than just using bread flour in the dough, we're going to improve the texture and the taste of it by adding about 1/3 of a cup of rye flour. This will really add an extra dimension to the bread without making it too tough. And this is a very traditional recipe. All it has is flour, salt, yeast, and water in it. There's no oils or butters or any of that nature in here. So we've got about 1.5 cups of bread flour in the bowl. We're going to add 1/3 of a cup of the rye flour, 2 teaspoons of kosher salt, and I'm eyeballing it. I'm going to say that's about 1/2 teaspoon of yeast. We're going to take this for a spin to mix the dry ingredients, and then we'll start adding some water. This is room temperature filtered water, and we're going to start pouring it in until we start getting a grainy texture to the mix. You can see the texture's changed. A little more water. Let that get incorporated. It's still fairly dry, but when we add the sponge to this, remember the sponge has a considerable amount of moisture in it, and it will help to moisten the dough. So we're going to add that sponge now. In all at once. And now we'll take it for a spin again, and we'll be watching the moisture content and the shape of the ball that starts to form. We want a fairly damp and sticky dough here, but as the Cuisinart needs it, the glutens will start to form, and the water will absorb. And so we need to be careful about how much moisture we use and how the texture changes. You can see the dough has already started to form a ball. And we're going to let this run for about a minute and then test it to see if we need some more liquid. The dough's been in the Cuisinart for about a minute, and we're going to test it to see its consistency. It is getting close. I'm going to add a little bit more water, but you can see it's formed a ball, and it's a complete mass now, and it's pulling away from the sides as well. I'm actually holding on to the Cuisinart so that otherwise it would walk across the countertop with this big ball in there. little more water. With these wet doughs, the secret to a crumb, a very open crumb with lots of big, like irregular, large holes in it, is to have a lot of moisture in the dough. The problem with having a lot of moisture in dough, of course, is that the dough is less likely to keep its shape, and it can also be very sticky. But the Cuisinart does a great job of helping to build up the glutens, and that will help with the shape issue. Pretty sticky. I'm just going to add a few more drops of water. So, we have a soft and sticky dough, which is a consistency we were looking for. Now we'll turn this out into a bowl, and a bowl large enough to allow it to triple in size. And we'll set this at room temperature for about 3 hours. We emptied the Cuisinart into this large bowl. You'll notice we did not oil the bowl first. We did not shape this into any kind of boule. We're still in fermentation phase, and this will start to bubble again as well if we let it stay out long enough. Again, we're going to try to have this bread served by this evening. So working backwards, we'll need about an hour to cook, about an hour for its secondary rise. So we'll have this probably in this form until at least mid-afternoon. We're going to cover this with foil and let it sit out at room temperature until we need to start forming it. This is the Dutch oven we're going to use. It's made by Lodge. This one happens to be cast iron enameled, so it's very hefty. It's been used and well worn. These are not actually stains. That's actually where some of the enamel has fallen off and the cast iron is coming through. No problem. The large, I can't tell you the capacity of this one because I don't know it, but the larger the better, because our bread will expand in the Dutch oven, and if you want a loaf of considerable size, a bigger Dutch oven is better. I assume you can use similar kinds of pans to do this. One of the nice things about a Dutch oven is it will fit into the oven because it's squat. I haven't tried it with another kind of pot, but I imagine it would have a similar impact. Although the nice thing about this particular Dutch oven is that it's very heavy, and so the heat will be even all around the bread, which will be important. It's now about 3:15 in the afternoon, so this dough has been rising since 9 this morning. So it's had some time to actually triple in size. You can see the difference in it, and you can see some bubbles popping at the top, which is a great indication of what we've got going on here. What we're going to do is we have a marble slab. I think any good countertop or cutting board will do. Just we have this, and so we're going to use it. We're going to flour this rather heavily because we're going to turn this dough out onto the floured surface and then gently manipulate it to form it into a rough boule that we will then let rise again over the next couple of hours. we have our board all floured, heavily floured, because this dough, as I reminded you, is sticky. We also have adjacent to it a piece of parchment paper. Parchment paper is basically a paper that's been impregnated with silicone to make it non-stick. It's really handy in the kitchen. You can find it now in most grocery stores. This makes the transfer of the dough either into the oven if you were doing a whole loaf of bread, or in this case into the Dutch oven much easier, and allows it a place to rise where we won't have to manipulate it again to get it into the oven. So the first part here is to turn the dough out onto the board, onto the flour. I have one of these great dough scrapers, which will help us release this. And one of the things we're trying to do with this dough is to try to not manipulate it too much. We're not going to do the typical punching down of it. There's lots of bubbles already inside the dough, and we want those bubbles to be present. You know, those big irregular bubbles and the smaller bubbles, we want that to be part of the crumb when we cut into this loaf. And so we're going to be gentle with this. All we're going to be doing is turning this out onto the flour, pulling up the corners to make a rough boule, flipping it over, and putting it onto the parchment paper. And then we'll let it rise again. That little amount of manipulation will give the yeast some new areas of the dough to feast on. So we'll continue to get the rise, but we'll also help to maintain or preserve some of the holes that are already here. So there's our dough. Now we're going to gently bring up what we describe as the corners. They're obviously not corners. But we're trying to basically pull what will be the top of the bread or the boule tight. And then we're going to flip it over and create a nice round ball. Again, try not to manipulate it too much. It's okay if there's all the flour on it. Once the dough rises, the concentration of that flour on the boule will be much less. We'll lightly flour our parchment paper. And then using this dough scraper, it's a great tool, gently lift the dough onto the parchment paper. At which point we're going to take the vessel, the bowl that we had this in, we're just going to simply use this to protect the boule from drying out. And we'll let that rise again for another hour, an hour and a half, even 2 hours. Our loaf is roughly doubled in size. It may look a little less than doubled. Don't sweat it. That has to do a little bit with our yeast, the amount of yeast we use, which is understandably rather stingy, but it improves the finished product. We're ready to put this in the oven. In order to do that, we got to break out our hardware, which is the Dutch oven. And I'm going to set this aside. And I want to cut down. We're going to use the parchment paper to help us transfer. So I'm going to cut off the edges of the parchment that I don't need help to transfer. Just makes it easier for me to not have to do it once it's in the bowl or in the Dutch oven. But you can see we are going to keep the parchment paper underneath. Let's see here. I'm simply going to pick this up by the corners with some tension and place it in the Dutch oven. Next I'm going to use a knife and just cut away as much of the excess parchment paper as I can. Only because at this point we don't need it. Once the bread starts to bake, it will separate naturally from the parchment paper, or from the Dutch oven's bottom. And if we leave the parchment paper, what can happen is you'll get these funky ribs on the side of the bread, which are fine, but just not attractive. One of the last things we need to do is give this bread an ability to expand, and that we do that by cutting a couple of vents in the top, so that when the bread naturally opens up as it expands, it does it along the lines that we've created. So I'm just taking a pair of scissors. I'm just going to lightly go in on one side and lightly go in on the other side. And that's all we need to do, because we don't want to sacrifice too much of that rise. We have our bread, or our dough, in the Dutch oven. I'm going to take this Dutch oven, I'm going to hit the lid with some water. I have a spray bottle, but you can just run under the sink. The last trick to this process, besides hitting the underside of the lid with some water, is to put this entire Dutch oven into a cold oven and then turn the heat on. By putting this into a cold oven and then heating it up, the contents of the Dutch oven heat up much more slowly, which allows the yeast to do a little more work inside the crumb of the loaf to expand it to an even larger and more airy crumb before the crust actually sets. So we're going to set this Dutch oven into the oven. It'll be a cold oven that we then set to 400 degrees, and then we'll check on it in about half an hour. So we popped our top off our bread after about 30 minutes, and it wasn't done. The crust hasn't set yet. And it's been 40 minutes now, and we can see how the crust is set pretty well. And at this point, the benefits of the Dutch oven have been satisfied. Now we're going to take our bread out of the Dutch oven, put it on a pizza peel, and put it onto our pizza stone in the oven, right directly on it, and let it bake for another 10 or 15 minutes until that crust gets completely brown, almost to the color of chocolate. Our loaf is looking nice and dark. It's been about 20 more minutes in the oven. And we use an instant read thermometer to measure the interior, and it's about 195 degrees, so that tells us the bread is done. What we're going to do now is we've turned the oven off. We're going to leave the door of the oven slightly ajar and let the loaf sit in the oven for about 10 to 15 minutes. This step leads to an extra crispy crust. If we were to pull this out now and leave it on the counter, some of the moisture in the bread would naturally soften the crust. But by leaving it in the oven for a little bit, that retards that process. So if you like a crispy crust like we do, we're going to leave it in here for another 10 or 15 minutes. We just pulled the loaf from the oven after about 10 minutes of resting, and I can't wait to cut into it. We still want it to let it cool down a little more, but one thing I want you to see, which is sort of a hallmark of traditional artisan loaves, are these blisters on the crust. And that is due partially to the humidity in the stove, or pardon me, the oven, but it's also due to the reduced amount of yeast we use. So I can't wait to eat this. We actually just made a big bowl, or a big pot of chicken soup, which is a perfect accompaniment for this bread. Kind of funny, we decided to make the accompaniment after we decided to make the bread. I'm going to cut into this and show you what the interior looks like. So here is the bread as we've just opened it. We've got a nice crust on the outside. The crumb, we'd like it to be a little more open, but it still feels very artisanal. And we can't wait to get into it. Okay, Maddie, how's the bread?
It's so good.